But remember, what are the big categories of personal injury? So if you go, what are the big categories of personal injury? When we talk about the sales presentation, this is after the campaign. So remember, you got the top 5 financial driver categories, and you should know at least one bullet point in every one of those categories. In other words, the diagnosis, you should know at least the main bullet point of the problem with that and how it's not being documented. So next is impairment. Next is loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities, duties under duress, and prognosis and need for future care. In other words, you should know without even looking at notes. I mean, obviously you should know the outline, the top 5 financial, and then you should know at least one bullet point of what the common problem is and how it hurts the attorney. So you could just talk off the cuff without having to look at notes. I mean, you should definitely know that if you're doing personal injury. And then same when you go to the next 5 categories, which is the 4 categories to defend the case. And then the 1 category of how to assemble the information. So the next 4 categories are what's the major bullet point for how to document to defend against pre-existing injury? What's the main bullet point of how to document to defend against the low property damage injury? Same with subjective only. There's only subjective only evidence with soft tissue injuries argument. What's the one bullet point to point that out of what's typically not being done and how it's hurting the injury award. And then medicals, that's not medically accepted. Some diagnostics are not medically accepted. You should have at least one bullet point in that category also. And then the last one is the 12 steps to tell the story to support the injury award. You should know those 12. And because that's the basis of the narrative report. It's the basis of your trial deposition. So you should know those. Okay, so that's essentially the 10 categories. And then remember in the presentation, we're just going through and pointing out all the things that are typically not being done and then adding them up when we get to the bottom. And, typically remember, the average attorney is only getting 3 out of 10 of these categories documented. And all this is pointed out and it's taken through step by step small. And then we do the math. Remember, we give a case average, we give a credit of $1,000 per category. And then we will subtract that amount. So if they've only got 3 out of 10 categories documented with the doctors they're dealing with, so that's 7,000, 7 categories they did not. That's $7,000. Then we take that and we multiply that times the number of soft tissue injury cases they get a month. And then we take that number and multiply it over a year. That's when you start getting up to $200,000 and $300,000 of money lost by these attorneys not getting the proper documentation. So you should know the basics of that. This as simple as I just said it. What's the number 1 outline? What's the number 1 key point for each one of those topics that's not typically getting done? Okay, that's like bare bones stuff. Okay, next is you should be familiar with the 4 types of injury award offers based on Colossus, whether it's no offer, low ball offer, high value offer, or a policy limit award. You should just know that and then kind of know which of those 10 categories on the left are essentially needed. Okay. And then the next category is the 4 types of potential injury awards based on the doctor's documentation. So you got the medicals, and then you should know how to calculate the medicals. Now this becomes real important because now you're talking the attorney language, you're talking money. You're now crossing over from medical to legal is what's happening right here. This is where their interest really goes high. So you should know the basics of the medicals and how to calculate to support the injury award for medicals based on the science of 3 phases of healing, and your physiological therapeutics, and be able to tally all that up to show the injury award just from that to support the medicals injury award. Next is the impairment injury award. What's the formula for the impairment injury award? You should just know the basics of that formula of how to convert that particular patient's injury into the impairment injury award. Next is the pain and suffering. Same thing. You should have a basic understanding of the formula to convert that documentation into the patient's injury award. Remember, these are highly valuable. This is really high-end stuff you're talking about here, about how to talk to attorneys, and how to create motivation with attorneys, and how to create authority. In other words, how to create referrals. This is where it's all at. This is where it all culminates. All this documentation culminates in these categories. And then, so that's pain and suffering. And then same with prognosis and need for future care. You should know the formula, how to convert that patient's into the prognosis and need for future care injury award. Okay. And then the next one. You should definitely know the 7 minimum categories that will stop lowball offers and create a high value injury award. There's 7 minimum categories of documentation that you want, that is needed, before you would say to yourself, yes, I'll go to court and testify for this patient because you've got a good case, or you've got a good case. And remember, you're the one that should be telling the attorney he has a good case, because they don't know medicals. And remember, that's what will happen when you do the offer and you do show them all the things that are being documented. And then you show them everything, that's all the categories of how it is documented, whether it's positive or negative isn't relative. What's important is that they know that you know all the categories. So whoever they do refer to you, they know that you know how to document all the categories, whether that patient has them or not. That's the single most important concept to get across from me to you as clients, or for you to the attorney. That's what creates authority with the attorney. And then, so you got the 7 minimum categories. So you should know what those are, those 7 minimum categories, and the difference between primary and secondary information, primary and secondary diagnostics, as it relates to MMI, because all of this doesn't really matter much unless the patient goes to MMI. Okay. So there you are. That's the big picture. Those are the categories. That's the big picture of personal injury. And of course, when you know how to do that, you create a tremendous amount of business, because you're obviously seen as the authority. You know what is and isn't being documented, and you know how to interpret it. And then, of course, once you add to that how to do the 25 steps of how to do a deposition or a trial testimony, you're off the chart. And this is usually why I found it's about half our doctors, when they do the offer after the presentation, when we do 2 financial driver evaluation offers, essentially that's solidifying your authority, that you know what to do, and solidifying the motivation that they're in trouble without you. That's essentially what that does. Remember, when you do that, 50% of the time, the attorneys will ask you, what do you think that injury, or how much do you think this case is worth? You need to know that. So you need to know the 7 categories. Does he have a good case or not? And then to know how much it's worth. In other words, if it's not, if he doesn't have these 7 categories, you need to be able to explain that to him. Go, well, this case isn't worth much. Let me share with you why. Here's this bare minimum 7 categories. And you got this, and you don't have this, and this. That's why this is not a good, or vice versa. And then same as they're going to ask you, as soon as you do that, they're going to say, how much is the case is worth? And then So you got to know the 7 categories, whether you have the documentation or not. And then you have to know how to convert the documentation, the basic formula of converting the documentation into those 4 injury awards. And then you lay that out. Okay. It's a great outline. And what it does is it shows them that you know what the hell you're doing. You're an expert at this stuff. And it's not only that you're an expert, you're the authority, but remember, none of that matters if there's no motivation. None of it matters. I say it all the time. You know people that are experts that you don't buy their products or services. So that's why this motivation part, and that's why we talk about pleasure, logic, fear. There's the pleasure part, which is the weakest of how to increase the value. There's the logic, and I just covered the logic. All the categories I just covered was the logic. And that becomes real important. How do you get from point A to point B? That is huge to create authority. And then, of course, the biggest zinger of it all, 80% of all motivation, is the pain, the amount of money they're losing. And it's that combination that creates the motivation. You're the authority, and he's got nowhere else to go but you, or he's really screwed. That's what happens. So that's the last category, is you got to know how much is this case worth. Well, take the documentation. How many of the 7 categories does it fulfill? It may even fulfill a couple others, but there's 7 minimum. And then you go, okay, this is how it would be converted. And this is how the basic formula of how the medical injury award would be supported. This is the basic formula of how the impairment would be supported. This is the basic formula of how the pain and suffering injury award is supported. This is the basic formula of how the need for future care is supported. There's no guessing. Right now, right? You're solid. You got from mechanism of injury, all the main categories, to converting this thing, and it's solid as a rock. And and there you go. There you go. So I just wanted to remind you of these categories. These are huge categories that you do need to know. And of course, if you do know them, that's when you get the referrals. That's when they ask you, how they do this. And they'll even ask you, what do you think they should ask? I'm always telling the attorney how much to ask, always. And that's what it should be, because you're the one that knows the details. Now, what else will happen? You will not only get all their soft tissue cases. When you know how to do what I just did, now you become the authority in all their personal injury cases, the ones that they wouldn't even consider using you with before, like a disc injury or even a fracture or concussion or all that. Because what will happen is they won't use you because they're not using, because they'll use you not because you're good at fractures. They'll use you because you're the only person, you're the only physician that knows how to put all these healthcare categories together. In other words, the fracture combined with X, the concussion or the soft tissue injury or whatever, or the disc. And you're the only one that knows how to take all these categories of documentation, put them together, and support that injury award and explain it. And this is why routinely our doctors are the ones that ask to testify in court and not the orthopedic surgeon or the neurosurgeon. Because remember, they're excellent at their slice of the pie. If you're only going to talk about the nerve or the fracture, okay, so they're good at that, but they don't know how to put the whole thing together. That's what we do. So we're excellent at that, and this is why routinely my clients are asked to give the depositions, and especially trial testimony, and not the medical provider. They'll just use a deposition of the medical provider. In other words, these doctors that are higher authority than chiropractors, they'll just use their depositions with their particular bits of information. They will not ask them to come in and put this whole case together. They'll ask my clients, you. That's who they'll ask, because you're the one that knows how to put that fracture together with the disc, with the surgery, because you know the 3 phases of healing. You know how it's all documented, all these categories are documented. And you know MMI, and then you know the results of all this, of how all these things affect the person's activities of daily living, and you can explain it all. Now you just have supplemental documentation with the orthopedist, neurologist, MRI, or surgery, or something like that. See, that's all. So that's also how you get in with the big cases, because you essentially won't, as a chiropractor, you won't be able to compete and get in with those cases. They're too high authority, okay, until you use the method that I teach and you go in with the soft tissue, become the authority, and then he sees you as authority and he goes, let me use you for all these other cases also. That's what happens. Routinely, that's what happens. I'm always asked to be the expert witness. Always. It doesn't matter who else is on the case. Orthopedic surgeon, neurosurgeon, it doesn't matter. They'll bring their pieces of the information in, but they're going to ask me to put it all together and explain it. That's what they're going to do. Same with you. That's what they'll do with you. And that's how you get to be just tremendous authority. Authority meaning referrals. That's what I'm talking about. Tremendous referrals. And then you got a totally separate problem now. You not only have more business than you probably physically can handle, especially if you're doing patient education, right? I mean, the typical doctor can only handle 20, no more than 25 new patients a month if he actually knows how to keep patients, because you max out. You don't have the time to see anybody, or you just start losing them. You're bad and you just start losing them left and right. And of course, that's terrible. But once you add patient education to that, you take your regular visits, your PI visits, it doesn't take a whole lot before you can't see any more patients. In other words, you need to know how to hire associate doctors. And that's a whole nother animal, knowing how to hire, train, and associate doctors. But you want to be able to service these attorneys. What does that mean? Not only with the patients they're referring you, you want to be able to service them in these other cities in your county. Because remember, every time you sell an attorney, they're going to have more, they're going to have clients coming from other areas of the county that are too far to come to you. And there you go. That's as easy as it gets to open the second office. In other words, you already have the business there. So we'll just ask 2 or 3 attorneys, say, what other towns in the county do you have PI clients that are too far to come here? And how many do you have? And we'll just do the math. You know, they have a certain number of cases. I'm going to go, well, geez, all I need to do is open it up, because the business is already there. You're just not cultivating it. So it's unbelievably easy to open an office there. And it can start as simple as inexpensive as renting 1-room professional office space. 1 room, you know, with one adjusting table and one therapy, et cetera. So it can be unbelievably inexpensive. And then we just hire the right type of doctor to go in their processes. And as that business builds, it's real easy now just to go over and put it in 1,400 square feet, or, you know, and then hire other staff members and things like that. But usually you'd have that business already available before you'd go there. In other words, you already know you have 5, 6, 7, 8 referrals from 2, 3 attorneys in that area. And you wouldn't want to do it with just one attorney. So if that relationship goes sour for whatever reason, you know, you're not stuck with an empty office over there. So I generally like to have 3 attorneys who are at least referring a minimum of, there's at least 2 per attorney, or say a minimum of 6 to that area. If I got 3 attorneys and I get a minimum of 6 between all of them to an area, I'm opening an office in that town. And then I'm just going to hire 1 staff member at the front, hire the doctor at the back. And then that doctor has to be trained in the checklist. He's got to know how to do all the documentation, and he's got to be trained in the checklist of how to do the narrative report. And that's all I want him to do. That's all I want him to do. Just do the documentation. And then I want a strong front desk person. And then I want a more of a passive, easygoing doctor. And there you go. and you just can open office after office after office, just like that. And that's about $250,000 a year. If it only sees about 80 to 120 visits a week at a $75 to $100 per visit, that'll be about 50% overhead. You'll make about, that'll collect about 500,000 pretty comfortably. That's not even booming. That's, again, that's seeing about 100 visits a week. At 50% overhead, that's $250,000 passive income. So, and the other option that I always talk about is you can always have marketing management agreements. And I won't get into this too much, but you can also go to these other areas in these towns and develop marketing management agreements. That's a lot more difficult because now you have to get chiropractors to agree with you and then to follow your guidelines. And that's like trying to herd cats. So that's much, much, much more difficult. It's much easier just to create the referrals, do the sales, create the referrals, and then you control everything. You have the checklist, and then you just keep building, and then you keep building. You add another attorney to it. And the attorneys that you do have, you solidify the relationship. You keep growing it. And with the regular contacts that I keep talking about, the regular weekly informational contacts, just reminding them all these things that you're doing to solve their problems. And remember, most of these problems, they don't even know they have. That's the big deal. The attorneys don't know. I mean, they know they're getting low offers, but they don't know, essentially, they're getting screwed over by their doctors. They don't know that. They don't know they're getting screwed over by their doctor's lack of information in documentation. They don't know that. That's the state of unconscious incompetence. And that's the big deal with marketing. You got to be able to understand that. There's tremendous business there, but they're in a state of complete unconscious incompetence. And if you don't know how to shift that, in order to slowly move it into conscious incompetence, and that's what sales does. So you have to know the basics of sales. There's plenty of steps you got to be aware of, and that's what our whole sales process does. That's why it's not just an advertisement. And they go, oh yeah, see, okay, come on, you're my authority. Here you go. No, doesn't work that way. So there you go. That's the big picture. Those are the big concepts. That's the end game right there. That's huge. That's the $1 million practice, the $2 million practice, the 2 or 3 or 4 practices doing $2, $3, $4, $5 billion. Okay. That's what that is. It all starts with just knowing the process. And what's great about that process that I just shared with you is once you know it, it's just rinse and repeat. You don't have to learn anything new. You just do the same thing to the next attorney and then the next attorney and the next. That's it. It's rinse and repeat. So you don't have to learn something new to go to another level of attorneys. You just have to be good at what I just covered and then rinse and repeat and just stack them. And then just start stacking the referrals and then make sure you're maintaining the relationship. Because that's the big problem that I find chiropractors do after they win the attorney over. They become the authority. They stop educating the attorney, or a lot of times they don't even contact them. I'm amazed at how many doctors join my program, been in practice 20 years, do personal injury, and they've never followed up with their attorneys. Never. And they never even asked how the attorney fared with, did they get what they wanted or what they expected with the case? I'm like, well, that's a good reason why they're not using you. So that's the abundance. That's the big picture. So follow the big picture.